Greetings, just on a morning walk and having a few reflections on some research I'm doing for the new book, especially in light of having returned from a sacred pilgrimage to Greece on the island of Ithaca. I wanted to just share with you some impressions that I find so stunning and compelling about the god Asclepius, but more importantly, the healing temples associated with Asclepius that lasted about 1,000 years in Antiquity, dotted around ancient Greece and Asia Minor. So just briefly, the story of Asclepius was that he was the son of a union between the immortal god Apollo and a mere mortal. I can't remember her name, but nevertheless, she took fancy to another mortal after the son was conceived, which of course antagonized Apollo, who decided to kill her, and in trusting another god to do the damage, she finds herself dead on a pyre or dying on a pyre, and Apollo has a turn of thought where he thinks, I'm gonna destroy this woman, but she's holding my child in her womb. So he performs the first cesarean section, excises his unborn child, and entrusts the son to the mythical centaur Chiron, who is the archetype of healing and mentorship, very powerful archetype, who raises this son, who is indeed Asclepius, who as time progresses becomes very famous for being a competent physician and healer himself under such divine tutelage. And then there are two various stories that contrast with each other about how Asclepius transcends mortality and becomes divine. The one story that I like is that he is standing one day with his staff and notices that there is a snake below him, so he slams his staff down and kills the snake. And as he's there observing this, he notices another snake come by with a mouthful of herb and kind of throws up the herb in the other dead snake's mouth, reviving it. And in observing, like a good scientist, observing the phenomenon, Asclepius has the idea to procure the right herbs and becomes very competent in medicinal usage as to himself have the power to make mortals immortal. And in this particular story, that power is very threatening to the gods. And so Zeus and I think it's Hermes, the god of the underworld. Of course, the god of the underworld doesn't like mortals becoming immortal because that means there's no cachet of souls for him, so he gets very upset. And Zeus also then feels threatened that the cosmic order is disrupted by this kind of divine intervention, or this intelligence that Asclepius, this power that Asclepius possesses. So he strikes him down with a thunderbolt, killing him. There is a story that it's too late. Asclepius is too advanced in his immortality. And so even though he's struck down and killed and sent to the underworld, he doesn't stay there very long. And eventually he ascends to Mount Olympus, which is the archetype or heavenly abode of all the gods. So nevertheless, we find that Asclepius as an archetype is this profound healer, somewhere between mortality and immortality, which I think is just an amazing, just even that little sketch is an amazing description, because it really shows how each of us are straddling two worlds. You have our body, which is temporary and decays and is mortal and must die, but we are also everlasting souls. So we straddle these two continuums, and that is both our existential dilemma and our existential blessing. More importantly, though, as I tell this story, is the healing temples that were dedicated to Asclepius that lasted for 1,000 years. There are some reports that suggest there were up to 300 of these in the Mediterranean and Asia Minor. Today, there exists 5 main temple site complexes that can be visited for their archaeological value. One in Pergamon in Turkey, and then one in Kos and one in Corinth. And Ephedrus is the biggest one. What happened at these, I think it's Epidaurus. That's about 2 hours outside of Athens. What happens at these Asclepeion healing centers is so profound and really captures my imagination. It's where I start my book. First of all, the Asclepeion, the healing sanctuaries, are very notably outside of the domain of industry and commerce. They're ideally situated in these bucolic and picturesque settings, far beyond the reach of the societies. So they're like true retreat centers, and they serve the function of precursors to modern day hospitals. I think it's very clear that people would have physicians at the time locally, but then if the treatment was not successful on the local level, then essentially people would head out on a pilgrimage to these remote destination healing sanctuaries. And I think just even that, to begin the story, is so compelling that, people in an urban center would try their hand at getting well, and then if that didn't work, they would set out on a pilgrimage. And as you know, I'm a huge fan of pilgrimage. It's a symbolic rites of passage, and I think just getting on the road with others and heading to a sacred destination, I think that really speaks to something very deep and primal in our minds and our psyches, especially if there's a altruistic or sacred or spiritual inclination or intention that's set. And so I think this is one of the things I'm really compelled by in the story of the Asclepeion, is that people are sick in the modern centers, in the urban centers, and nothing is working. Your Prozac isn't working. And so you set out on a sacred pilgrimage to these very remote and picturesque and natural settings. And I've done a little work, and it seems that these natural settings have some very commonalities, despite where they are geographically. They all have something very similar, where the air is very fresh, and it's very picturesque and green and lush. But there's also very clean and pure waters that were used for bathing, ritual bathing, or hot and cold baths. And this is where our idea of a spa comes from. And also there's some indication that some people that are following these ley lines are energetic lines on the planet, where sort of an energetic alignment creates for perhaps a conducive vibration for healing. And that's disputable in the research, of course, but it certainly piques my interest. So the healing that would occur at these healing sanctuaries that are situated in very remote, picturesque places, there were 2 phases. So a patient would arrive on pilgrimage, having probably traveled a very long way, and they'd reach the sanctuary gates, and they would start the first phase of their treatment, which was a purification and involved diet and bathing. So they would bathe in these hot and cold baths, and they would also start a very nutritious diet based on the local food sources, very well prepared. And it's known that the treatments could last days, if not weeks there. So you're really going for a spa, an intensive spa retreat. And I can see, mentally and physically the first phase of purification, where the body is prepared and the mind is prepared through these treatments. And then one is sort of graduated into the second phase, where it gets very interesting. At the center of these healing centers was the temple dedicated to Asclepius. Of course, Asclepius is depicted as a bearded, very robust, godlike figure with his toga, but he's also carrying his staff and circling his staff, and ascending upon his staff is the one single snake. So many of us are very familiar with the two intertwined snakes ascending a staff, which is the caduceus. But this is a single snake, and this is the sort of emblematic feature of the Shakti rising, the energetic chakra, vital life entering the central channel and rising up for enlightenment, which is a very common theme in the esoteric traditions. Nevertheless, one would enter these healing sanctuaries, and one would be greeted by basically the precursor to psychotherapists. They were called temple priests, sort of aides to Asclepius, and people were given a chant or a mantra according to their particular diagnoses, and they were encouraged to make offerings to Asclepius. And I think these offerings create some psychic sense of reciprocity between oneself as the patient and the healing god or the archetype. But I think that what I imagine that does is it activates the placebo effect, because I just think that there's something about opening the power of the mind to one's own innate capacity of healing by using the land bridge or the mirror externality of the god or the archetype. There's something about engendering a sense of reciprocity. I give the god something, I'm closer to the god because I'm closer to the god of healing, and my faith and my conviction and my belief and my receptivity and my openness activates my receptivity to my body's own innate capacity for healing. So that's all enacted. That's all enacted in the central theater of the temple. And then begins this sort of apex of the healing ceremony, which is this process called incubation. Basically a dream journey. There are some indications that the dream journey in these massive dormitories surrounding the healing sanctuary, there are perhaps 50 to 100 beds laying on the floor. Patients would be given by the temple priests some sort of plant medicine. We're talking about a psychedelic-induced dream journey experience, 500 BC. And they were given this plant medicine, and it would induce a very hypnotic sleep. And inside the sleep, a couple things could happen. There could be a visitation by Asclepius and a direct healing as a result of that contact, like making contact. Or there might be a very cryptic message about the healing regimen or therapeutic approach that would be required, or some sort of dream that would otherwise require some interpretation upon awakening. And sometimes it wasn't Asclepius himself who visited the patient, it was one of his daughters. And I believe the two prominent daughters of Asclepius are called Hygeia and Panacea. So you gotta love the Greeks. Nevertheless, upon awakening, if there wasn't a direct, profound alteration of consciousness that would sustain a healing realignment, then there would be a cryptic message or code that would then be interpreted by the temple priest. I mean, this is the precursor to dream analysis. This is 500 BC. This is what perhaps Jung was drawing on when he's doing his dream analysis, interpreting the collective archetypes, and helping people sort through the messages that are being delivered to them from their collective or personal unconscious, which contains within it the message that they really need to heal, to align, to regain wholeness, and to access the soul's voice speaking to them in a language that they may not understand, that requires some interpretation, which the temple priests help interpret, decode. And so then what would happen is, after receiving the divine intervention, there was another few days to weeks of healing regiment. And here, this is again very profoundly holistic in nature, because on site in these healing sanctuaries, the Asclepeion, there was gymnasiums where people would go for physical exercises and rehabilitations. There was massage. There was, again, the nutritious diet and the spas, hot and cold baths. But there was also theater. And in the theater, there would be the arts. And I think at Epidaurus, there is a amphitheater there that is still used today by the Greeks. And I believe it still seats 15,000 people. And it is built so precisely that you can hear a pin drop all the way in the rafters. Nevertheless, can you imagine being seated with 1,500 patients and watching a theater performance, or hearing poetry or music, healing sound? And of course, the theater is also very profound. How does that help with the healing process? I mean, I think theater is profoundly healing because it evokes a kind of projective identification. And in other words, you, just like when you watch a modern day movie, you see yourself as the character. And if the character goes through its heroic journey, a scripted heroic journey, and you identify with them, him or her, and then you feel all the associative emotions, and maybe some of those emotions are, required to be purged and experienced and felt in order for the block to be released, so that energies in the body and mind can be open and recruited for healing purposes. So there's this very strong cathartic element to theater, which I think we very much underplay and miss. And it stirs my imagination, this whole setting of going on pilgrimage, the phase of purification, the meeting of the deity, the chanting and the placebo effect, the plant medicine usage to create an altered state of consciousness, the dream journey proper, its interpretation, and all its auxiliary holistic treatments of nutrition, diet, and exercise. I mean, it's truly holistic before we even used holistic. It was natural. And as, of course, theater, arts, music, sound, stirring the imagination, community, and then all of it done in a pristine setting. There's something about this that is, of course, really speaking to me right now. I just feel that, as many of you do, we have the industrial medical complex has just gone so far astray that it no longer treats us as human beings. We are simply just machines on an assembly line. My recent health scare showed me that in such a profound and clear way, where I felt so dehumanized with my ailment, that people were so insincere and inconsiderate and lacked empathy. And it really made or forced my body to really shut down and feel so uncared for and so mistrusting. And I know many of you feel the same way. You have been spun in and spat out of the medical industrialized complex. You have lost faith in your healers. You have been maltreated and dehumanized. You've been thrown some sort of synthetic medicine by Big Pharma I mean, in my case, they would, before even saying one or two words, the first inclination was just to put me on a table, put me out and cut me. I ended up finding only 2 physicians with specialty in my particular condition that wouldn't perform an actual surgery. There was a conscious procedure that they offered, but more importantly, the one that I ended up going with was humane in his disposition. He really took time to listen to me. I was telling him that part of my reluctance to being going under was I was having a post-traumatic reaction to the, even though it's 10 years ago, the death of my father, and that I was terrified, and so he really heard me and was willing to work with me. And so, I mean, the number one thing I learned with my near-death experience and the selection, at least on the physical level of dealing with the physical ailment, which was just a small part of it, obviously, was that I found a doctor who was atypical, somebody who cared and was willing to work with me and willing to treat me humanely and be sensitive with me and listen and take time. I mean, can you imagine that's how far we've gotten, where these simple basic things that mean so much are no longer part of the treatment. Nevertheless, I feel like it's worthwhile just to empathize with so many of you who are like me, just fed up with how far astray our industrial medical complex has gone. It has forgotten so much about what it means to be a human being, and not only how to treat us, but the cure. The cure must include the soul. The cure must include the soul, which means a safe environment is a prerequisite. Mindset or attitude, lifestyle, a community, nature, the healing apparatus, rather than it being mechanical, the more natural it can be, the better. And so here, just the symbol of the Asclepion is so powerful and compelling to me. The pilgrimage, the natural setting, again, the spa, the holistic treatments, massage, sound, energy, diet, exercise, catharsis, sleep, hypnosis, theater, arts, music. I truly believe that in this day and age, we need more of the Asclepion, and so part of this book, I'm just watching myself fantasize, which of course is, the soul speaking. The soul speaks in many languages, and one of it is fantasy, which of course needs to be interpreted. But one of my fantasies is now, just some of my own colleagues and friends, if we were to revive the Asclepion in 2 ways. I've been fantasizing. One, to take some of my friends and students on a pilgrimage. This one wouldn't be to India or Nepal for a Buddhist pilgrimage proper, but how about a healing pilgrimage to the Asclepion for healing ceremonies? I can imagine my buddy Phil and I taking some of you guys to Pergamon in Turkey, or Kos, or Corinth. There's also Asclepion right below the Acropolis in Athens, and also some very, very powerful healing caves underneath the Parthenon. And going to Epidaurus, of course, the main one, with that beautiful amphitheater with 15,000 people. But imagine we could go there and actually do some profound meditations and healing ceremonies, even do the medicine Buddha there. We get Phil to do some healing sound. And then I had this dream or vision that, some of the things about the Greek ruins are that they're no longer active. These are passive sites where you go, and most people just go and take pictures and get the guided tour, but I wouldn't want to do that. And one thing I love about going to India and Nepal is that these sites are still very much active. Pilgrims go there and actually participate in the site the way they have for thousands of years, and we could do that. I imagine we sneak in there, one of these historical archaeological sites, and actually sleep there. We'd evoke medicine Buddha or even Asclepius. I don't know about taking plant medicine there, but you could definitely use natural sound to invoke an altered state of consciousness, go into deep hypnotic sleep and have dreams on these very sites, and we could interpret them the next day. That's one dream. That's one vision. And the other is to find some funding, somebody with deep pockets, a patron that's equally dissatisfied with the current medical industrial complex and wants to build us a center somewhere like this, beautiful natural environment, someplace where there's energetic ley lines, someplace where there's beautiful natural springs, hot and cold springs, somewhere where there's fresh air and beautiful fertile soil for growing vegetables. And I've already sort of got a wonderful network of people where I have a Reiki master and Lena, who's been healing my body. She's got wonderful healing hands, and Phil, of course, on the sound bowl, and Emily and I are both therapists, and Alex has, also got healing hands and is into somatic work and nutrition, diet, exercise, music, sound, dreams, astrology. It's my imagination running wild. Maybe I'm beginning to bore you as I ramble, but I guess one of the things I just want to leave you with is don't squash or squelch your dreams. It's your soul speaking to you in coded message, and we should just take a little time to heed and sort through and decipher what our real calling may be. Hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you for listening, and take good care.